financial accounting. So after I completed university, I worked in the banking sector in financial accounting, both at the Reserve Bank and, for those of you who remember, Advance Bank. I then started my academic career at the University of Sydney. My research focuses on financial accounting and also corporate governance, and I've received a number of large ARC grants in both of those areas. And the latest one is looking at director elections, so I've got some expertise around corporate governance and some of the things that have been discussed today.
Excellent, thank you. Professor Wright.
I've been an academic for 40 years across 3 universities, and in that time I've done a lot of teaching, but I've also had a number of head of department roles. So I've been in management at universities for a significant period of that time as well. My research covers a lot of corporate governance issues that are relevant in Australia today, and certainly corporate governance of not-for-profit sectors is of great interest to me currently. But also I'm the lead Australian author on the only Australian textbook in financial statement analysis and valuation that would have undoubtedly been the textbook used by any consultants that we may have engaged at the university over the last 15 years. I've been teaching that subject for about 25 years.
Thank you, Professor Wright. Dr. Chinovsky.
I graduated from Tasmania and I worked for Coopers & Lybrand, which is a predecessor of PricewaterhouseCoopers, and for Deloitte, but please don't hold that against me. During my academic career, I principally taught financial accounting, although I've taught almost across the entire spectrum of accounting education, including an analytics program that we've recently launched at UTS. Principally, the subject I teach is accounting standards, which seems quite dry, but the way I frame it is in terms of incentives, in particular the decisions that people can make, the accounting choices they can make, and what incentives drive those accounting choices, which I think is particularly relevant when judgment is called into play in making decisions. Just to wrap up, in order not to inflict my name upon you, if you want to call me Robert, I'm absolutely happy for you to do that. Thank you.
I thought I'd just figured it out. I'll practice. Thank you very much, all of you, for that overview. I wanted to, I guess, start with a very basic question, which is, why did you put forward the alternative proposal? You're busy academics by the sounds of it, with lots of other things you could be doing. Why did you put forward the alternative proposal?
Maybe I could start on that. I think as academics that have all had a lot of experience, we've seen in various institutions in which we've worked change proposals that have involved restructuring various aspects of the way the university is administered and the way in which teaching and research is structured. And so we, between us, I think, have seen quite a number of examples where things have not worked out particularly well relative to what the university management may have legitimately intended. In this particular case, what the university is proposing seemed to be quite drastic, and so I think it's quite reasonable that people who don't necessarily resist the idea of change in any way, but are concerned that massive change all done at once creates very significant risks in an operational way. Can you actually achieve it, as well as the reputation effects? That was what encouraged us to actually go, well, is the underlying narrative to this proposal quite as valid as perhaps it's being claimed? How big is the UTS financial crisis? And so that's really started us down the track of trying to actually do some detailed analysis. And then we're very fortunate that Associate Professor Doherty is particularly good at the financial modelling aspect of the task. And so that's what then led us to sort of try and build some projections about future outcomes to see the extent to which we'd call it a crisis versus a cause for concern.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
I'll just add to that over the last 3 years when I was head of department in accounting, I had some conversations with the then dean who would quote things from the university's leadership committee that, the university's losing money. And I flippantly said at one point, we're not losing money. That's, there's no cash flowing out. It's a profit. It's the way it's interpreted. And with some of my colleagues, we then started back in 22 analysing the university's financials and essentially giving an alternative perspective. I know that many of my colleagues, not just those here today, continue to analyse the university's financial position. It's something we do with a great deal of passion as well as expertise. And we would say that the interpretation that's being given at the centre of the university is not the one that we would give to the accounts.
before I go into the question, so am I right? I mean, obviously I've read your proposal, your alternative proposal, and the thing that struck me about it was that quite a lot of the university's approach is really a question of management choice. So if you choose to behave or you choose this course of action, this is going to be the result. So it's not a predetermined, there's not some set of numbers that means you have to act in this way. Would that be a reasonable assessment?
That's extremely true. I'll let my colleagues answer perhaps in more detail, but even to the extent of the measures that are used, we find the university flipping between cash flow and profit and some other concept of profit, depending on the number that tells the story the best. And we have been consistently saying that the cash flow is positive and has been each and every year, and the necessary accounting measures that really there's no choice over do not represent the best measure of performance.
Okay, thank you for that. And before I throw to you all to tell us a bit more about the alternative proposal in non-accountants' terms, for the benefit of me, if not for the rest of the committee, I do have to ask, like, what's in it for all of you? Professor Taylor, you spoke about, you're just doing it. I mean, is there anything else? Is there any motivation? Is there anything? Do you get anything out of doing this?
No, other than feeling like at the end of the day we'll have contributed to hopefully an informed discussion about the underlying situation and hence what the best way forward really should be. Chair, you will know yourself from your own prior work experience that the overwhelming majority of academics feel very passionately about the welfare of their institution. And that's really what our concern was in this case, not wanting to see an overly drastic course of action taken, partly perhaps in response to actions not being taken in prior years, but we didn't want to see such a drastic course of action taken if it wasn't absolutely necessary because of the risks that poses.
Thank you. Okay, and if I could ask you now to tell us a bit more about the alternative proposal and I guess specifically how it differs from what the university has, what's become known as the OSI, but their proposal. How does it differ and how does it represent perhaps a better outcome in terms of particularly staff and courses and those kinds of things?
Perhaps I should answer that question.
Certainly.
So the overarching objective of the alternative proposal is to see whether there's an alternative path to address the key concerns outlined in the university's OSI document, the Operational Sustainability Initiative document, that doesn't involve significant academic redundancies and significant redundancies of support staff across the university. There's a section in the alternative proposal that outlines the risks associated with such significant disruption to the academic workforce. A question came up this morning, I noticed, about the success of UTS over the last 15 or 20 years. And I would say it's not due to the wonderful buildings we have, which are great, it's due to the hard work of the academic staff and the people that support them. So the objective was to try to avoid that and to see whether there was an alternative path forward. Part of that involved us looking at what the sources of increase in recent costs have been, and it was clear from that analysis that increased academic salaries were not responsible. In fact, increased in non-academic salaries, particularly staff in central administration, were a very significant part of the increase in costs that we've experienced just since COVID, just since 2020. And so one of the things the alternative proposal does is to address that source of cost increase. And we recommend significant reductions there. Unfortunately, that involves the redundancy of something like 86 people in central administration, but that's been a very large source of increased costs recently. The other thing we do is to model how we can repay the debt that's due for repayment in 2027. And whereas the university wants to pay all of that back in one go, that's a $300 million bond debt maturity, we're recommending that there's probably sufficient cash reserves to pay back half of it and then to refinance half of it. but only for 2 years, so that by the end of the planning period, which is up to 2030, we actually achieve what the university wants to do. They want to pay all of the bond back. Well, that can be done, but just not in 2027. It involves some refinancing for a couple of years. But we end up in 2030 in roughly the same place in terms of cash flow and debt repayment that the OSI seeks to achieve, but without 400 staff being made redundant.
Okay, thank you. And so just to confirm, because when I read it, I just wanted to confirm this. You're talking the same outcome, but on a maybe 2-year delay. So the same outcome that the university is looking for, but for some reason they're suggesting it has to be in 2027. For some reason that we, that's you, us, the public, staff, haven't had it explained to us as to why it needs to be 2027. Some vague risk of something in the future.
Well, yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, two reasons have been offered to us for the preference to repay back the entire $300 million in 2027. The first is a vague reference to the appetite for risk, which is never really unpacked for us in any detail. And then the second, perhaps it does attempt to unpack it to some degree, is that I think the Vice-Chancellor is worried about a reduction in revenue of a COVID-type experience happening again. Now, that's understandable. That could happen at any time. But there are other ways of managing that if it were to occur. And the question is whether you think you need to take drastic action now because something might happen in 2 or 3 years' time. That doesn't seem a sensible approach. And most institutions the size of the university carry some debt. It's quite a normal business practice, and it makes complete sense for UTS.
I think you also make the point that it's not the business of universities to be worrying about making a profit. I mean, the converse of what you've just said is, yes, you can carry debt, but also, relatedly, it's a public institution. It's not there for turning over a profit, which I think is a point that you make in your submission and your proposal. Could I ask what the response has been to the proposal, maybe across the professoriate, so your colleagues across the university, the UTS Council and the Vice-Chancellor? I don't know who wants to take that.
I'm happy to take that. So the original work that we did, as has been explicated, was trying to understand the root of the current problem set and then think a bit more about whether there's another way in which we can achieve some of the outcomes that we would actually agree with in terms of some of the challenges the university, specifically in the sector, faces. When we have when the document got into public circulation, the response has been quite surprising to us, overwhelming actually, with the fact that there is some kind of alternative to the current proposal. The second thing is more transparency about the nature of the financial situation in the university. One of the things that we've had some challenges with as we work through the OSI documentation, both forms of it and some of the other communication around this, is that there's lots of statements and assertions around the financial situation in the university or the consequences of particular choices and decisions, but no modelling or no detail or no data as it relates to that. So as evidence-based researchers, we're always interested in, what does the evidence, what does the data actually tell us about the nature of this problem, and where does the cause sit? But there's been very little addressing of the causes of some of the challenges. And so what our colleagues have said back to us is that it's created a level of transparency and data and an alternative source of information about why we're in the position that we're in as an institution, and then the fact that there are other ways in which we can go about this. And particularly, I think one of the points, really salient points that we make in the back of the report is that we're not averse to an analysis of the viability of courses and so on, but this needs to be a root and branch analysis led by faculties and disciplines working through the nature of how we might adapt and change the nature of what we teach moving forward, which is a normal part of an education process in a higher education institution that leads research and teaching nationally and internationally.
So you've had great support from professorial or the professoriate. What about from council or the vice chancellor?
Maybe I'll field that because I'm in the invidious position of being both on council and as part of the group of six. So the professoriate recommended that council meet with the group of six to discuss the alternative plan. And the ultimate response was that council did not, but delegates of council, chiefly chairs of committees, meet with the group of six. And the thing that particularly concerned me about that was I was fortunate enough to attend a recent Finance Committee meeting where various arguments were put, to my mind, and this is my opinion, not particularly coherently, but various arguments were put against the alternative plan. Yet some of the people who put those in Finance Committee were not invited to that meeting with the group. So I have a concern that the level of engagement is probably less optimal than it might otherwise be. So that's been the response. I have to say, of course, all credit to the Chancellor and Council that, and I'm not disclosing contents of what happened in Council, but the Chancellor very objectively presented our plan to Council. But Council did not engage with the group of six as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. We did hear earlier from the Vice Chancellor, and I might just quickly throw to Professor Wright, because he mentioned, he got into quite a lot of detail about particular expenses and expense categories, and I wonder if, given your overviews, you might be the person to talk a little bit about the growth in the different areas of expenditure. And I don't know if you heard the Vice Chancellor before, but I wondered if you could sort of explain to us a bit what's been going on.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I may defer to Professor Doherty, Associate Professor Doherty, who has probably a finer eye on the detail. But our analysis showed that over the period 2020 to 2024, the revenue of the university increased by about 4% in round numbers per annum over that 4 or 5 year period, and expenses increased by 5.75%. Mm-hmm. So expenses are already running ahead of revenue, which in any business sense, we would agree that is not sustainable. When we broke down the source of the increase in growth, in very round numbers, academic salaries were growing at 3% per annum over that period, so below the growth in student revenue, and you can imagine as a previous academic what that means to class sizes. Mm-hmm. Non-academic salaries, the support staff, to a small extent within faculties, but more largely within the centre of the university, what's called the faculties, the divisions, grew at nearly 6%. So double the rate of the growth in academic salaries. That is, of course, a combination of positions and rates of pay, and there's not full data through to the end of that period, but we suspect it's got more to do with the number of highly paid positions in non-academic roles. But even more outstandingly, the growth in the category of other expenses is over 8%. So revenue growth of about 4%, double the rate of growth in other expenses. Now that is partly discounts to attract international students to the university. Not a great accounting practice, but we won't get into accounting detail for you. So really the revenue growth in essence is not as high as even 4%. But the other category of that is expenditure on IT. And I did hear the Vice-Chancellor say that it was necessary, but we have credible evidence as well as numbers that would show that growth, that expenditure in that area has really been excessive. And in an institution that is looking at getting rid of 10% of its academic workforce, to continue spending on IT infrastructure seems to be misaligned, in my opinion.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand over to my colleagues. Ms. Merton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us, and really appreciate your expertise. If I might be able to touch on issues relating to the alternative plan, and my colleague, Madam Chair, touched on this a little bit too, just whether we may be able to explore a little bit more about how the model differs from the current governance system.
I'm not sure that you would say the financial model differs from the current governance system. I suppose what's different is that we've done this work, we've put it out there in the public domain as a basis for suggesting that UTS management and council might want to more carefully consider the initial OSI proposals in their scale and scope. But I guess the contrast is that for most people at the university, they really don't have a clear understanding as to what the rationale is for such dramatic simultaneous change across the academic and operating aspects of the university. So the key word I'd make about what we're doing is transparency. It's very clear. We've provided detailed financial analysis that hopefully is understandable to people who are not necessarily financial analysts or accountants. And I think that's probably different from the way the initial proposal was presented around OSI, where we have a crisis as basically the narrative, but I'm not sure how effectively it's really been demonstrated.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I appreciate that you spoke earlier just about the increase in transparency in terms of the work and what's. I'm wondering whether we may be able to just some examples about what's that going to look like? Is it about greater availability and disclosure of reports, or how are we going to get to that?
Robert, from a council point of view, might like to contrast.
Well, this is not necessarily a council issue. I'm in camera this afternoon, and internal council questions can be asked then. Okay. But council does get high-level summaries of what is going on. But I need to articulate quite strongly that we do not get into the detail. And in fact, one of the things that has somewhat disconcerted me is that when I ask operational questions, because operational questions for me are the measure of whether strategy is working. Operational questions are not viewed favourably within council. I have twice gotten the message, we are here for strategy, that's operational, don't go there. Going to your earlier point about governance, I know Professor Taylor said that our model doesn't directly address that, but when you look at the cost pattern, the way that cost growth has happened at the centre, one of the things that happened in probably the last decade is we moved from a profit model to a cost model. And the unfortunate, and God forbid you interpret the profit model means everything's got to be profitable, because that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that when an entity within the university sees both a price signal and it sees its costs, it can adapt as it goes. Universities' natural approach is to adapt to circumstances. The price signal has been taken away from us. We get a budgeted allocation to cover our costs, but we don't see the revenue numbers directly. And so that responsiveness that you would essentially expect in autonomous systems is absent. So I would actually say that the centralisation likely, and this is mere speculation on my part, but the centralisation may well have allowed that central cost growth to occur at the cost of the university's financial position.
Mm-hmm. Right. If I could just add, the transparency around claim cost savings is always a problem in large institutions like a university. The one TAFE example from 2016 to 2020, there were a number of claim savings there that the New South Wales Audit Office identified that weren't realised. And the basis for how the estimated saving was actually arrived at is often not very clear. So you might say, let's combine two faculties into one, and that will save $3 million. Well, where does that $3 million really come from? Is it because you've only got one dean rather than two? What if that means you need two heads of schools as well as a dean? Now you've got 3 leadership positions instead of 2. So there are very important assumptions that consultant-type plans for restructuring typically involve, but they're not obvious to the consumer of that plan.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. White. Mrs. Mitchell, I think you've got some questions. before it comes back to us.
Just quickly, Dr.
I've just got Mrs.
I ask you what your status is on the council. Are you an elected member or an
I'm an elected member.
Right.
Yes.
And in which category are you elected?
Staff.
Staff.
Staff. Right.
Sorry.
Academic staff.
Sorry, we were just getting some clarity on the panel. Yeah, apologies, Mrs. Mitchell.
No, that's all good. Thanks, Chair. I have two questions, and I'll just ask them, and I'm not sure who's best to answer them, so I'm happy for you to jump in, any or all of you. You might have heard earlier, I was interested in the part of your alternative plan where you were talking about opportunities for alternative or additional revenue sources, and this idea about having a sort of profitable consulting services using the university's expertise. I just wondered if someone could talk to me a bit more about that, sort of where that idea came from, why you think it's necessary, would they be set up to do both internal and external work? I found that quite an interesting proposal.
Okay, we're just deciding who to answer, Sarah.
Yeah, sorry, as I said,
It seems I've been allocated to
Professor Brown?
answer that question. I think there's some very useful ways of thinking about this that we already see in the public domain. So when government, for example, needs expert work done on particular areas, they can go to consulting firms, for example, and get consulting reports or work done there. But also experts in universities can actually deliver that sort of work. And indeed, if you look at the work done by the UTS Ageing Research Collaborative, or UARC, which I'm involved in, we've done quite a lot of work in the broader ageing care sector. We've also got lots of other examples across the university where we've got internal experts who are able to mobilise what the research evidence says are solutions to problems or challenges, or in fact conduct original research to solve problems which are actually currently unsolved, and we genuinely need the knowledge for. And so there's been quite a lot of thinking done, particularly in the business school, and Associate Professor Peter Doherty was involved in some of this work around how we would actually mobilise that expertise to contribute more broadly to society around some of these larger questions, and in particular where you've got very large and what I often describe as wicked problem sort of issues, where you need very deep level thinking and expertise, pulling together absolute world-class experts who can explain what the evidence and the research literature says to this particular problem or point is actually an enormous opportunity for the university and for the university sector largely, rather than perhaps going with the individual expertise or experiences or time-limited, experience-limited views that are often provided by perhaps some consulting organisations.
And could I just add something?
Of course.
So just two comments, Mrs. Mitchell. Thanks for the question. I'm not sure I would say it's necessary. I certainly think that it's necessary in the sense that if our standard revenue streams from students is under stress, which is a point that Andrew Parfitt made very clearly earlier, then it raises the issue of what other ways can universities raise money. And it seems to me that using our knowledge to address the sorts of questions you might encounter in business or in the engineering world is a really smart one. Why go to KPMG when you can come to the UTS Business School, is how I would say it. The second point I'd like to make is that we did experiment on a small scale with this 6 or 7 years ago, pre-COVID, where we hired an industry professor to essentially spear up a consultation and consulting type practice, and that was on a very small scale with just a couple of interns who were part of that process. And so the idea came, well, is it not possible for us to scale that up so that we might offer some competition to the standard consulting firms, and not just in business but in other areas across the university?
So I guess I think you've sort of answered my question, but is it the idea that if something like this was to be set up, it could both eliminate the need for the university to be so reliant on external consultants if they can use in-house expertise, and it could also be an opportunity for further income that unit then did external work as well. So it's sort of both. Is that right?
Well, I think my thinking about the primary objective is the latter. It's to pursue a new source of income, and I'm not sure why, an army of experts who are capable of doing that shouldn't harness that knowledge to generate additional revenue sources.
Ms. Mitchell, if I could just add to that, I think two parts to what you asked. The first part, by all means, it would be great if universities generally used the resources that are available to them within the institution more. And I think that's what I'd call part of a more collegial system to how a university is run. And without wanting to sound like some ageing professor wistfully looking back to the good old days, I think that there has been a general decline in collegiality in universities generally in Australia. And I think sometimes some of the problems are a result of that. The second part you mentioned, I think we need to be a little bit cautious. I'd hate to see a situation where universities were told to effectively operate like quasi-consulting firms because consulting firms have certain advantages over universities in the way they operate at what they do. And also, if the university becomes a quasi-consulting firm, then I think the research aspect, particularly of the university, starts to come under threat quite significantly. I mean, many academics are engaged in industry work. Professor Brown mentioned an important part of UTS, the ageing-related research. We have a grant from the Accounting Standards Board to help them understand how well prepared companies are for the impending climate reporting requirements. There's activity like that all over the university as it is, but I don't think we could really become UTS Limited as a competitor to KPMG or McKinsey's.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. As I said, I think it's an interesting sort of concept, so it's good to understand a bit more about the thinking behind it. The other thing I just wanted to raise, and it's in a similar vein in terms of university alternative income, and in the submission to us you talk about, I guess, looking at things like endowment finance or philanthropic support, and you mentioned that a lot of the universities, I think you use the United States as an example, sort of do more in that path than we do in Australia. Can you speak to that a little bit more in terms of why that's been suggested? And again, happy if someone else is best placed. Large panel of expertise. So
I'd be happy to speak to that. I spent a number of years as Associate Dean External Engagement, so was quite involved in that, and also been quite involved in that part in the Central University because of the research centre that I run. There is a lot of opportunity in that particular space. There are a couple of challenges. One is you need very effective teams to be able to do that kind of work within the university and within faculties. They need to understand the research and activity of the academics involved in that. You also need really strong alumni connections and to be able to work with alumni. There is also a fundamental culture difference between, say, for example, the US and how this is done in the US, the philanthropic sort of activities opposed to Australia. So I think there are some challenges more generally with that model, even though there is opportunity. The critical thing with that model is it's a long, what they describe as a long burn model. So it takes a long time for that work to happen. It typically starts with small gifts, and eventually you get very large gifts to support really meaningful programs of research. So there's a couple of key things that actually need to be in play for that to work effectively, and so universities have to have fairly long-term planning activity and competence to be able to make that system work well.
And so is it your suggestion that that's something like that sort of, whether it's initial work or as you say, it needs a lot of thinking put into it as to how it would operate and that it would be a long-term thing, but is the suggestion that that's the sort of thing that the university should be looking more at now with that long-term future, done in a careful and considered way, taking on board what you're saying about the cultural sort of differences between us and the States? But would that be something you'd recommend that the universities look at?
I think UTS specifically, I can only speak for the UTS experience. I know the university itself has been conscious of this particular opportunity for quite a long time, having been involved in this. And, the Vice-Chancellor has spent, a lot of time and energy meeting with alumni in order to be able to develop this sort of work. But I'd sort of reiterate, it's a pretty long-term problem. And the other thing, which is a really significant issue, is that there needs to be a really large and significant problem that needs to be solved, that someone who has got sufficient resources wants to contribute towards solving. If you don't create an environment with a sufficiently large academic staff who can work together and work on these very large problems, you will not have the problem to work with in the first instance. And I guess that goes to the sort of one of the central planks of the work that we speak to in our document, which is that it is our view that cutting academic staff, making academic staff redundant, who are actually the engine room or the ideas production function in the university, makes that sort of activity highly problematic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've got one very quick one, Mr. Diadam. Before
I just want to ask about, I think John Cotter talks about creating a sense of urgency in an organisation, and it's often a technique that's used by management to confect a crisis, to create a sense of urgency with an agenda to actually drive cultural change or a reorientation of the organisation rather than actually solve the crisis. I wonder whether the UTS situation fits into that kind of scenario, and whether you wanted to offer some comments along that observation.
Professor Brown?
I'll say very briefly, if you read the very widely used, well-known Change book by Cotter, if you look at chapter 3 out of Cotter, and if you read the discussion in chapter 3 and you do an analysis of what some of the narrative is in the OSI document, I think the ideas overlap. Probably very strong would be my frank view.
Could you please provide chapter 3 on notice to the committee?
That would be much appreciated. I wonder.
I'd be happy to provide you with the book.
I ask whether, this is a bit of a cheeky question, whether you guys are available for the workers' compensation system.
Before we close out, I just want to ask one very quick question. You've referred, I think in your submission, but certainly today, about to one TAFE a number of times. And of course, we all know that the Auditor General had quite a scathing report on that program. It's my understanding that the architect of that program is now the Chief Operating Officer responsible for the implementation of the UTS proposal. Am I correct in that? I can see it's not, but for Hansard, can someone confirm? Or?
Who wants
Well,
to
I wouldn't be. I don't know that he was the chief architect. He was the chief operating officer.
Thank you
over
for that
a 4-year
clarification.
period.
That's a good clarification, mate. Thank you for that, Professor Taylor. And with that, our time has ended. Very much appreciate your willingness to appear today. Very much appreciate your efforts in putting that alternative proposal together and also submitting us today. I think we did ask you to take some things on notice, and we may also send some supplementary questions through. The Secretariat will be in touch about the timing of that. We thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Thank you.